Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Let me begin by thanking the Leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition for recently naming me the spokesperson for work and opportunity for the Conservative caucus. And I will approach this issue and all issues by breaking them down into those two constituent parts, work and opportunity. The reason that those two things are so important is because they will determine the well-being of our people. The best anti-poverty program is a good job. The greatest social safety net we have is a strong family and a strong community. I'm here today to talk about how we can use the power of work and opportunity to lift people up, particularly people who are less fortunate. And it is through that prism that I will comment on the government's proposed increase in Canada Pension Plan payroll taxes. Let's start with the impact of that policy on work. What will be the impact on work? First of all, it will make it more expensive to work. Anybody who has a job and receives a wage will pay higher payroll taxes, according to one estimate, as much as $2,200 in extra payroll taxes, and that, Mr. Speaker, will be matched by the employer. $2,200 per household, and then an equivalent amount for each contribution by the employee will then be paid by the employer. And that deals with the second half of the work dimension. Not only will it be more expensive to work, it'll be more expensive to hire. And when it becomes more expensive to hire, understandably, less hiring happens. That is particularly the case for small businesses, whose ability to take on marginal costs like payroll taxes is lower than that of larger firms. Now, this is particularly important, Mr. Speaker, because new evidence has emerged this month showing that small and medium-sized firms are vastly outpacing big business when it comes to hiring people. A report from Scotiabank said, and I quote, "Annual payroll growth among small firms, fewer than 100 employees, averaged 1.4% from 2010 to 2015, significantly stronger than the 0.9% increase among larger firms, 500 or more employees, though lagging the 2.0% gain among mid-sized firms, those with 100 to 499 employees. Small firms generated more than 5,000 net new jobs over this period, or 45% of national payroll gains. In other words, Mr. Speaker, small companies were responsible for half of the net new hiring that occurred between 2010 and 2015. And large businesses, the kind that the Liberal government likes to associate with, are not generating jobs in the same numbers as the small and medium-sized enterprises are. This new payroll tax will make it more expensive for these small companies to hire people, and therefore they will do less hiring. Anybody who's been out in their communities and talked to small electrician firms, small construction companies, local mom-and-pop shops will tell you that they are hearing of the increased burden of government that applies every time a small business tries to hire somebody, whether it's restrictive labor laws, higher payroll taxes, provincial and municipal building code restrictions, or the endless volumes of paperwork that a small business must complete for the mere crime of creating jobs and providing goods and services in a community. All of these burdens make it more difficult for our entrepreneurs to hire and grow their payroll. And this new development, this new payroll tax, will make it harder still. Now, let's be clear. The government has argued that the CPP payroll tax increase is not a tax at all. It's simply deferred income, that it goes in one end of the CPP machine, and when the person retires, it comes out the other. That is not the case for the small business. The entrepreneur will pay an increased premium, but he or she will get absolutely nothing in return for it. Their pension will not go up as a result of the increased payroll tax. Their costs will go up. Now, the reality is that they don't have spare change sitting around waiting to throw at the government, so they'll have to make difficult decisions. And the Canadian Federation of Independent Business has already said that large numbers of employers will either cut wages or cut jobs to make up the extra cost that this new tax will burden them with. That is the particularity of this new tax on small business. But what about businesses in the export market? Canada is a trading nation. Without exports, we don't have an economy. And I look at the struggling manufacturing sector in Ontario, already hammered with literally tens of billions of dollars in inflated electricity prices imposed by the provincial government to reward well-connected so-called green energy firms. We look at the new carbon tax that these firms will have to pay just to keep their factories operating. And now they will have to pay new contributions to CPP. Large manufacturing firms, particularly in the auto sector, have already warned that this triple whammy will make it more difficult to create jobs here in Canada. We have a global supply chain, and investment goes where the returns are. And if the returns on hiring Canadians are lower because the costs are higher, then these firms will just go and build and hire somewhere else. And they have lots of options. Other places around the world are fiercely competing for opportunities and jobs for their people. And they're doing it by lowering taxes and streamlining red tape. This government is doing precisely the opposite of that. And so we can expect that this new and expanded tax on jobs will mean fewer jobs and less work. As the critic for work and opportunity, I think that's terrible. We need to expand job opportunities for people by lowering the cost of hiring. If we do that, Mr. Speaker, then our entrepreneurs, large and small, will come here and hire in record numbers. And that is the agenda that we should push. And let me remind our colleagues across the way. They say we need to have more contributions to CPP. If someone loses their job, the contribution they're making to their CPP retirement is zero. Zero. They get absolutely nothing put away in a rainy day fund, so in their retirement nest egg. So if you want to ensure that people have enough money to retire, make sure they have a chance to work so that they can contribute to their savings in the present day, rather than taxing them out of a job. So let's move to the second part of my new duties as critic and spokesperson on the issue of opportunity for Canadians. What kind of opportunity will this proposal bring to the Canadian people? Well, the government says we need to increase mandatory contributions to CPP because people cannot afford to save for their retirement. Let's think about that for a second. People cannot afford to save for their retirement, so we're going to force them to. If the government's position is that nobody has any money to set aside at the end of the month, then how are they going to afford to pay this new tax? It's got to come from somewhere. It's not magic. If it's the amount that their government is proposing the average family contribute is $2,000. If they don't have, Canadians don't have $2,000, what are they going to do when this new tax kicks in? They're not going to have a lot of options. When in fact, options is precisely what we should be providing. We should live in a big, opportunity-filled, free enterprise economy where Canadians get to choose what is right for them. That's what free enterprise means, and that's why it is the greatest poverty-fighting machine ever invented. So, prior to this government taking office, we as a Conservative government introduced the tax-free savings accounts. Now, the government does not actually understand the purpose or the use of those accounts. It has suggested that tax-free savings accounts are merely a tool for the rich. In fact, they are exactly the opposite. RRSPs, it has been proven, tend to be weighted more in that direction. TFSAs are weighted to favor low-income people. Why? One, low-income people often don't have access to the biggest tax-free savings account that has ever existed in Canada, which is capital gains tax exemption on a primary residence. We've long had a tax-free savings account for real estate. It's that you can grow the value of your property infinitely without paying any capital gains tax at all, as long as it's your primary residence. But what about low-income people who do not have a primary residence, who instead rent because they've never been able to afford a down payment? A tax-free savings account is precisely the equivalent for them. It gives them the ability to save tax-free through equities and other savings instruments, the way that more affluent Canadians already have saved tax-free through their ownership of a principal residence. Two, lower income people pay a lower marginal tax rate because they're in a lower tax bracket. As a result, an RRSP doesn't necessarily save them as much money when they contribute to it. So if your marginal tax rate is somewhere around 20%, an RRSP contribution does not defer nearly as much, either in percentage terms or in absolute terms, as if you are a millionaire, like the finance minister, and pay a marginal tax rate of 48%. You, the millionaire, Mr. Speaker, would save 48%, whereas the working class person would only save or defer 18 or 19% on an RRSP. With tax-free savings accounts, Mr. Speaker, not only does the savings accrue over time, but it also exempts a low-income person from having eventual GIS and OAS benefits clawed back later in life, because TFSA earnings are exempt from that clawback. So lower-income people can retain the GIS and the OAS while they take gains out of their tax-free savings account. Now the government will say, oh, well, we know low-income people never contribute in the first place. Actually, the stats from Finance Canada prove exactly the opposite. The average income of a TFSA contributor is $42,000 a year. Now maybe the government doesn't consider that middle class. Their so-called middle-class tax cut did not give a penny to anyone earning below $45,000 a year. I consider that middle class, and at the very least, the people who earn $42,000 a year are working hard to join the middle class, and TFSAs are one way to help them do it. Finally, Mr. Speaker, of those who actually maxed out their tax-free savings account, the average income is about $60,000 a year. Now, across the way, our friends will say it's impossible for someone earning only $60,000 a year to max out a $5,500 tax-free savings account. And that is because the Liberal government does not understand when and how people contribute to those accounts. They don't do it always out of their income. They do it out of big life events. A spouse dies, and an elderly survivor takes the inheritance and wants to put it in a place where it will not be taxed. And that's why they take that inheritance and put it in a tax-free savings account. Or a senior gets too old and can no longer climb the stairs in their large multi-level house. So when they dispose of the house and they move into an apartment, they've turned a hard, real asset into a liquid asset, and they can put that money in a tax-free savings account. And that's why the people who've maxed out TFSAs are not all rich. They're often people with low incomes who've had major life events that cause them to turn their assets into cash, and they want to turn that cash into a tax-free income. We want to give them the opportunity to do that, and that's why we created the tax-free savings account, and that's why we increased the amount people can contribute to it. The government, on the other hand, wants to force everybody to contribute through the CPP, arguing that instrument is the only way people should be allowed to make their new contributions to their savings. But increasingly, we're finding data that shows that it is not the best savings instrument compared to other alternatives that are out there in the marketplace. In fact, a recent study by Fraser Institute demonstrated that the 1.07% management cost, that's the cost of just running the CPP, is actually quite high. It's not low, as was earlier argued. It's actually quite high. And increasingly, Canadians can have access to exchange-traded funds, which you can buy with a click of a mouse on the internet with very reputable firms like Vanguard or iTrade or others, and they are massively diversified with extremely low management costs, much lower than the CPP. In fact, you can own the entire American stock market, the entire Canadian stock market. In fact, you can own the entire worldwide stock market, be diversified into every single company that exists and is publicly traded on planet Earth with a management expense ratio that is lower than the current CPP. In fact, Warren Buffett was recently asked, how would you encourage the average investor to prepare for their future? And he said, given that most people don't have the time or expertise to pick one stock at a time, he would suggest exchange-traded funds because of the extremely low management expense ratio, because it costs so little to invest the money, and because it diversifies so widely that it protects the investor against major losses. Now, that is just one vehicle. But there are all sorts of other vehicles that are available to people if they so choose. I am not here to offer them financial advice. I mean, I think most of us in this place, we struggle just enough to plan our own financial futures. But we do acknowledge that there is a cornucopia of opportunity for people out there in the private sector, and Canadians are smart enough and they are wise enough to make those decisions for themselves, and those decisions should not be robbed from them by a government that thinks it knows best how they ought to prepare for their future. And that is exactly what this government is doing by forcing people to invest more money in an expensive-to-manage CPP savings account. I conclude by turning the House's attention to a column recently written by Kevin Libin in the Financial Post, who said, and I quote, "So if a new report by Morneau Chappelle, the human resource firm once chaired by our current federal finance minister, finds that the new enhanced CPP doesn't significantly tackle all that much, and in some ways makes our retirement system even worse." The article goes on. Even Bill Morneau, before he was a politician and still worked at a human resources firm that bears his name, co-authored a book with Vitesse that repudiated the fear-mongering media, quote, fear-mongering...
Order. I see the honourable member for Saanich Gulf Island rising on a point of order. I started to detect this commotion. I didn't hear what perhaps the member for Saanich Gulf Island could enlighten me on.
Entirely inadvertently, I'm sure, the official opposition advocate for opportunities used the opportunity to use the personal name of the Minister of Finance. And I think he will regret that. Just a hunch.
I appreciate the intervention there by the member for Saanich Gulf Islands. The honourable member for Carleton may recall that even, and for the benefit of the House actually, when the name of another member appears in a citation, one can't use the name even if in doing so you're doing it indirectly through a citation. So even in a citation we essentially rule that out of order, and the member will then substitute, I'm sure, and use the appropriate name, either the title or the member's riding name. The honourable member for Carleton.
Sorry, I'm new here, Mr. Speaker. Quote, even the finance minister, before he was a politician and still worked in the human resources firm that bears his family's name, co-authored a book with Vitesse that repudiated, quote, fear-mongering media stories and, quote, overblown worries that Canadians were under saving. Now, he'll force Canadians to save more for their retirement, whether they want to or not, or whether they need to or not. Eventual changes to the benefit from 25% covered earnings to a third, and a heightened ceiling on covered earnings from what would have been $72,000 to $82,000 will result in some Canadian workers paying as much as 40% more in CPP contributions by that date, up to an additional $2,200 a year deducted from their take-home pay, according to Finance Canada's backgrounder. Mr. Speaker, this finance minister opposed precisely what he is now implementing and enforcing on Canadians. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, if Canadians want to contribute more to a large diversified savings fund, there are millions of options available. There are hundreds of options available to these millions of Canadians. And we as government should not impose our will upon them and their retirement savings plans. And that is why we on the Conservative side instead favor voluntary options, low-tax plans rather than high-tax schemes, to free people to make the best choices for their lives and for their futures. Thank you.